earth-shattering, potentially, gravity-moving. I don't even know. I'm like Jeff Bezos. I'm in space. I can't tell up from down right now. You talk about a potential just gravity-changing, college sports-changing, landscape-changing moment. It came out on, I guess it was Wednesday afternoon, when the Houston Chronicle reported that both Texas and Oklahoma are considering and pursuing a shot to join the SEC. And it was the topic that basically overtook all of college sports on Wednesday, obviously with SEC Media Days going on. Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, was asked about it. He gave a no comment. Texas gave a no comment. Oklahoma gave a no comment. And so basically we're in this holding pattern as to, is this story true, is it not true? But this, of course, comes on, I don't know if you want to call it the heels, but about 10 years ago, Texas and Oklahoma tried to leave the Big 12. At the last minute, they decided to stay. The college sports landscape really didn't change all that much. But here we are 10, 11 years later, and it appears as though Texas and Oklahoma again are trying to potentially get out of the Big 12 to the SEC. And let me say this. This is a great story. This is a fascinating story. It gives me amazing content here in the middle of July when I thought I'd have nothing to talk about. But I will also be honest. I don't believe that it passes the smell test. I do not believe this is something that is coming. Before we get to it, let me explain why on some level it does make sense, okay? Obviously, Texas and Oklahoma, two of the biggest brands in college sports, trying to get out of the Big 12 into the SEC. And there are two reasons to me why this makes perfect sense on paper for this move to potentially be happening. It makes sense on the first part because it makes sense for the same reason that everything in life makes sense. Dollars and cents, money, dollar bills, y'all, right? Everything in life, follow the money. It is all about the money, and this is no different. Texas and Oklahoma, as I just said a minute ago, I think they're indisputably two of the 5, 6, 7 biggest brands in college football. I know Texas hasn't been that good over the last couple years, but when you talk about in terms of revenue production, when you talk about in terms of interest, when you talk about in terms of a national brand, when you talk about in terms of money spent on the team, it is hard to find anybody bigger than Texas. And then Oklahoma is right behind Clemson and Alabama in terms of overall college football playoff appearances. They have been to 4 of the 7 college football playoffs. Ohio State has been to 4. Clemson and Alabama have been to 6 of the 7. And so you're talking about 2 of the 6, 7, 8 biggest brands in college football. If you want to put Texas here and Oklahoma there, I'm not going to argue with you. And so it makes sense because I do think there are probably people in the SEC offices right now kind of licking their lips, rubbing their fingers together like Johnny Manziel saying, if we could get Texas and Oklahoma, let's rip up that ESPN contract. Let's go back to the negotiating table. And I cannot even imagine how much money you would potentially be talking about if Texas and Oklahoma came to the table. Again, just think about any given Saturday. Bama at Oklahoma, Texas at LSU, LSU at Oklahoma, Texas at Auburn, Florida, you go on and on. It's just the number of more high-leverage, high-volume games would be insane. Obviously, it would only create more interest. It would bring a new state into the SEC footprint with Oklahoma. And you're just talking about tens of millions of dollars added on, hundreds of millions potentially. I don't claim to be a sports business expert. We are talking about a lot of money that would be pumped into the SEC coffers, and this is coming off a historic TV deal that was basically recently consummated here in the last couple months. On top of that, there is a second other reason that this makes sense. Do Texas and Oklahoma really need the Big 12? And this was partly what happened 10, 12 years ago when they tried to leave in 2009, is that basically Texas looked around and said, wait a second now, what do we need Iowa State for? What do we need Kansas for? What do we need Kansas State for? Yeah, Kansas is good in basketball, but football drives everything. And by the way, you guys know, I'm a huge college basketball. I love college basketball. I'm the voice of college basketball. But we all know that football drives these decisions, and Texas and Oklahoma are looking at Kansas and saying Kansas State and Iowa State say, you bring nothing to us. We bring all the value to this conference. Any TV deal without us is Bupkis. It's not worth the paper that it's printed on. Nobody's tuning in to see Iowa State Baylor or Texas Tech Kansas State. They just aren't. It's simply the truth. And I know we are coming off a year where Iowa State had a good season, made a big bowl game. We've had in years past TCU, Baylor, schools like that win Big 12 regular season titles. Ironically, Texas is one of the schools that when you look at schools in terms of their most recent Big 12 title, Texas is towards the bottom of the list. I tweeted it out and Texas fans freaked the you-know-what out. But I did say, last time Texas won a Big 12 title was 2009. Since then, Kansas State has won a title, Oklahoma State's won a title, Baylor's won a title, TCU has won a title. And so the point I'm trying to make is that while Texas has not had success on the field, I do think those two brands look at those other schools and say, y'all aren't really doing much for me. Y'all aren't really bringing much to the table. You have no value without us. And so that is why this story on some surface level makes sense. And again, it was funny because I had all these Texas beat writers chirping at me because I said, I don't think it makes sense for the SEC. And they're saying, well, you don't understand how college athletes. Yeah, I do. I do. I've been around the block for a while. I understand how this all works. I just don't buy that this is a story that has real legs. And let me explain why. I've sat down, I've thought about it, I've spent a ton of time researching, I made a few phone calls today. There are several reasons why I just don't think this makes any sense at all. The first one, there's something called a grant and rights deal, and it's basically certain entities, and it's not just in college sports, but certain entities have certain intellectual property for a certain amount of time. What does that mean? That was a bunch of big legal words that make no sense. I even confused myself. But grant and rights basically means that as of right now, the way that the contracts are currently structured, there is only one league that can make money off of Oklahoma and Texas football. That is the Big 12. That grant and rights deal goes until the end of the 2025 fiscal year, which means that even if Texas and Oklahoma wanted to leave for the SEC tomorrow, even if they wanted to leave, they couldn't. The SEC could not make $1 off Oklahoma and Texas football in a TV contract until the end of the 2025 fiscal year going into the 2025 football season. So we're about to enter the 2021 football season, 22, 23, 24. That's 4 full football seasons before the SEC could make $1 off of Texas and Oklahoma. The second thing, there's other money issues involved, right? The money sounds great in terms of how much you could get and all that kind of stuff. But guess what? You know what else is the truth? On top of that, the SEC is not making any money off Oklahoma and Texas for 4 full football seasons. There's also something called a withdrawal fee. In other words, if Texas and Oklahoma leave the Big 12, this is not a big deal, but you're going to have to pay tens of millions of dollars. Reports are varied. It's hard to know exactly how much, but we're talking about $20, $25, $30 million to leave the Big 12. Now, I will say, if Oklahoma and Texas can get a shot at the SEC, then they're going to do it. They're going to pay that money. But I am just saying, when you look at the fact that the SEC can't make any money off them for 4 years, they're going to have to pay money to leave, I don't see why this makes sense. The third thing, and this is a big one, and this is something, so it's interesting, right? So I'm getting a little bit older in life. I got a few gray hairs coming in. My mind isn't as sharp as it once was, but I bring it up because one of the benefits of getting old is that you've seen stuff happen before. You know how stuff works. You're not just reading about history on Google or Wikipedia or in a book. You actually lived it. And I bring that up because I was just starting my sports media career in 2009 when the original wave of realignment went down back in 2009. And to me, that's important because there were a lot of lessons learned in that first go-around of realignment that I think a lot of people have forgotten 12 years later. And how could you not? Life goes on. You have kids. You have a child. You leave this. You do that. You buy a house. You can't remember everything. But one thing that happened back in 2009 that remains relevant today is this. When it appeared as though Texas and Oklahoma were going to be potentially leaving for the Pac-12, remember, there was a talk for a while that the Pac-12 was going to be the Pac-16. As a matter of fact, at the time, it was actually the Pac-10, and the Pac-12 the Pac-10 was going to become the Pac-16. And what ended up happening was that Texas, Oklahoma, all these schools wanted to leave, and you know who got involved? The politicians. And the politicians basically said, look, y'all can leave, but you can't leave without taking the other schools with you. And so what do I mean by that? If Oklahoma wants to leave for the SEC, Oh, you don't think Oklahoma State's going to get involved? As a matter of fact, you know the only entity that came out and spoke out on behalf of, the idea of Oklahoma leaving? Everybody was given no comments left and right. Oklahoma was, Texas was, the Big 12 was. You know who wasn't giving a no comment? How about this? It was Oklahoma State, who basically came out and said, we are not in favor of this. We are going to fight this. And so you have to remember that politicians will get involved. Oklahoma State, to the Oklahoma economy, to what Oklahoma is very important. And the politicians in Oklahoma, many of which are Sooners grads, but of course many of which are Cowboy grads, they're not going to let Oklahoma State get left behind. They're not going to let Oklahoma State become irrelevant as Oklahoma goes to the SEC and rakes in a ton of cash. It's not going to happen. And it's the same with Texas Tech and Texas. They're not going to let Texas just go to the SEC, leave Texas Tech behind, leave everybody scrambling. Listen, I don't remember all the details, but Baylor got involved last time. I mean, there's so many entities, there's so many political people, but the one thing that we learned from 2009, politicians will get involved, and they're just not going to let Texas and Oklahoma do whatever they want without thinking about the other public schools in that state. In the case of Texas, it would be Texas Tech. In the case of Oklahoma, it'd be Oklahoma State. The fourth reason that I don't believe that this really has legs, you know who has to sign off on this? The SEC schools. And you know who I don't think is particularly excited about this? A lot of the SEC schools. Think about it. So, first of all, for people who do not understand, the SEC, for this decision to be made, for the SEC to expand in athletics, they need sign-off from 11 of the 14 schools, which means that it only takes 4 no's for this to just go away. Doesn't matter what Texas wants, doesn't matter what Oklahoma wants, doesn't matter what Greg Sankey wants. If you get 4 no's, if you don't have 11 of 14 schools agreeing to something, it doesn't happen. Well, you know who was one of the first people that was asked about this at SEC Media Days on Wednesday? It was Texas A&M's AD, Ross Bjork. Just so happened this story broke during Texas A&M's media availability, thank goodness, because here's what Ross Bjork said. Ross Bjork, the AD at Texas A&M, said, "We want to be the only SEC program in the state of Texas. There's a reason why Texas A&M left the Big 12 to be standalone, to have our own identity." Well, you need 11 of 14 SEC schools to sign off to approve Oklahoma and Texas joining the SEC. Well, you get 4 no's. They don't come. The first no is pretty public. It's Texas A&M. Texas A&M, you can argue, you can debate, you can this, you can that. I don't think it has done anything other than help Texas A&M and its brand by being the only Texas school in the SEC, okay? I don't think there's any debate. It's been great for recruiting. It's been great for their national profile. Again, I'm old enough to remember Texas A&M in the Big 12. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to A&M. We have a ton of people that listen to this show in Texas, many of you A&M fans, grads, alums. And I do remember the days when Texas A&M was in the Big 12, and they really did go into the shadow and fall in the shadow of Texas. Now, part of it was Texas was really good at that point. Mac Brown, Colt McCoy, everything's rolling. But the bottom line was it really helped Texas A&M and its brand to go to the SEC. And so we know Texas A&M is going to vote against it. You know who else is going to vote against it? Per the Austin American Statesman, Kirk Bowles, really good reporter in Austin, says that Missouri will vote against it. Missouri, of course, was the team that left the Big 12 with Texas A&M to come to the SEC. Kirk Bowles, Austin American Statesman, legitimate newspaper in Texas, said Missouri will say no. And it makes sense. Missouri, like Texas A&M, left the Big 12 because they were tired of Texas's BS. So you already have 2 no's, and I have to wonder how many other programs, how many other schools, how many other school presidents are going to vote no. Because to me, I think what you have to look at this is from a few different perspectives. First of all, besides just take dollars and cents out of it, who does it really benefit for the SEC to add Texas and Oklahoma? Because, again, money's great. But at a certain point, how much money is enough, right? Like if you're Kentucky, if you're Arkansas, if you're Mississippi State, if you're, again, Missouri, who already we know is going to vote no, if you're South Carolina, how many football facility upgrades can you do? How many new baseball stadiums can you build? How many juice bars? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much money you're making if you have no chance to compete. And so I think when I look at the SEC, I look at a school like Arkansas. I look at a school like South Carolina, like Kentucky. And some of you agree, disagree. Oh, add the two biggest brands. I want to go play in Austin every couple years and take my family on a vacation. I get it. But if you're Kentucky, no disrespect, it's tough enough to compete for an SEC title with Georgia and Florida. Now you're going to add two more schools into the mix, maybe potentially Alabama and Auburn come to the East and Texas. Like, at a certain point, why do you need all the money? Things are good right now. Your program's going as well as it could possibly go, and you're going to get knocked down You're going to get knocked down a couple pegs if Texas and Oklahoma decide to come in. Same with Arkansas, same with Ole Miss, same with Mississippi State, same with South Carolina. Even the good programs, I'll be honest, what do they really have to gain? Think about it from LSU's perspective. LSU just won a national championship 2 years ago. Ironically, you know who they beat on the way to the championship? They won at Texas. Sam Ehlinger. We all remember that game. Joe Burrow was awesome. I bring that up to say, if you're LSU, you're recruiting really well in Texas. Yes, you compete with Texas and the Big 12 schools and Texas A&M and Alabama, but you're recruiting really well in Texas. Do you now want to give Texas and Oklahoma the advantage of saying, hey, you want to stay in that boring old Big 12, you score a bunch of points, but you don't compete at the highest level? Well, guess what? Like if you're LSU, it doesn't make sense because it's a recruiting disadvantage. Even Alabama cleaned up in Texas, and I know Alabama's not afraid of anybody, but they're cleaning up in Texas right now in recruiting. They signed 4, 5, 6 guys out of the state of Texas in this most recent recruiting cycle, and I think they're sitting there saying, like, why do we want to give that up? Why do we want to bring Texas to the SEC? Why do we want to give them the brand recognition of being an SEC school? Let's just keep things how they are. And oh, by the way, let's keep recruiting the heck out of Texas. And so when I look at it, I don't know how many schools it makes sense for in the SEC and, frankly, how many schools it benefits. And then finally, does it really benefit Oklahoma and Texas? To me, what's most interesting about this report at this exact time, I understand the money aspect of it. But think about it if you're Oklahoma. I have a buddy, so I host on Fox Sports Radio every Saturday night with a guy named Arnie Spanier. I have a buddy, Chris Plank, who is the Oklahoma sideline reporter. And I have not talked to Chris Plank since all this story broke, to be clear. But I asked him about college football playoff expansion when it happened a few months ago. And I asked him, I said, you're Oklahoma. You're one of the few schools that benefits from college football playoff expansion. Do you like college football playoff expansion? He goes, I love it. You know why? Because if we can get in with 4, we're definitely going to get in with 12. And so if you're Oklahoma, the system is already in your favor. First of all, this idea that if Texas leaves that Oklahoma is going to somehow get left out if they win the Big 12 championship, it's nonsense. Oklahoma is never going to get left out of a 12-team playoff if they have a resume that's good enough, okay? So if you're Oklahoma, what benefit does it come to go to the SEC when you're playing in a league where, let's be honest, 9 times a year, you just got better dudes than everybody. Now, there's 1 or 2 games where you really have to compete and you have to game plan and you got to pull out special stuff. But 9 games out of 12, 10 games out of 12, it's over it's over the second you walk in the building. And so if you're Oklahoma, what do you gain by going to the SEC? A couple $1 million a year for what? To compete with Alabama and LSU every year? Stay there. If you're making a 14 playoff, you're going to make a 12-team playoff. And so to me, that is why I'm just going to say it. This doesn't pass the smell test to me. Now, could I be completely wrong? Of course. I've been wrong on a lot of stuff before, but I've also been right on a lot of stuff. And so I know that there's all sorts of rumors out right now, and I know I saw Paul Feinbaum is saying that he thinks it could get done soon. All I'm telling you is this. To me, right now, this doesn't pass the smell test. Now, you know what does potentially pass the smell test? I could see Texas wanting to go independent. That is something that I could see because I think Texas now looks at the Big 12 a little bit like I was saying a minute ago. I think when you look at Texas, it kind of makes sense for them to sit there and say, wait a second now, there's going to be 12 teams in the playoff, and if we're like 10-2, we're going to get into that playoff. And so why do we need the Big 12? Why do we need to split money? We already have our own TV network. Let's branch off and go independent. We don't need the SEC. We don't need the Big 12. We'll just schedule 12 of our own games. If we go 10-2, we're getting in that playoff, and we're good to go. And so I get it. I get why it makes sense. I think it's a fascinating story. But forgive me. This, to me, does not pass the smell test. I could be completely wrong. By tomorrow, by the time you listen to this, Texas and Oklahoma could be in the Big 12. But I just do not see it.